Welcome back, dear listener. As promised, we shall continue our discussion on the Aeldari Xenos. Fall of the Aeldari, M25 M30s. Ancient Aeldari lead their people aboard the craft worlds to salvation before the fall of the Aeldari. Before the fall of their potent interstellar empire, the Aeldari were a technologically and psychically advanced humanoid species, generally considered the most powerful intelligent species in the entire galaxy. Their technology had advanced so far that little or no labor was required by individual Aeldari to provide the daily necessities of life. As a result of the sheer boredom and ennui that resulted, at some point during the 25th millennium AD by the Terran calendar, groups of Aeldari began forming what were known as pleasure cults, dedicated to the pursuit of every pleasure and sensation that life had to offer their kind. Despite the prediction of the reclusive Aeldari seers that warned of impending doom if the Aeldari did not change their hedonistic ways, government within the Aeldari Empire soon collapsed, and the moral degeneration of their homeworlds and various colony worlds continued unimpeded. As the pursuit of ever more extreme experiences reached its height, death reigned in the streets of Aeldari cities, hunter and hunted each being part of a twisted ritual of destruction that consumed millions in orgies of savage bloodlust and excess. Some Aeldari were able to see that their now corrupt society was destroying itself and fled in disgust. These refugees would settle in the distant rural colonies of their empire and would later be known as the Exodites, or take to the massive continent-sized Aeldari craft worlds and sail amidst the stars as merchants and explorers, far from the scenes of hedonistic excess that were destroying the heart of the Aeldari Empire in the galactic northwest. Upon death, the souls of all deceased self-aware beings traverse the bounds of the physical realm and go to rest within the hyperdimensional realm of psychically reactive energy that undergirds all of reality, known as the Immaterium or Warp. As more and more corrupt Aeldari died, their souls began to coalesce into a larger entity within the Warp, a living representation of the hedonistic corruption that had defined their lives. This growing presence in the Warp caused massive warp storms to aggregate across the galaxy, eventually making interstellar travel and communications impossible for the colonies of humanity, bringing on mankind's age of strife. This Gestalt collection of corrupt Aeldari souls gained self-awareness sometime in the late 30th millennium, creating the powerful new warp entity known as the Chaos God Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, named She Who Thirsts by the Aeldari. When Slaanesh came to be, an ethereal explosion occurred that spanned the extent of warp space within the Milky Way galaxy, with the epicenter being located within the Aeldari core homeworlds of the galactic northwest. All Aeldari caught in the immense psychic blast were instantly killed, their souls consumed by Slaanesh, and the surrounding region of space was transformed into a massive permanent warp rift, later known as the Eye of Terror to humanity. The core Aeldari homeworlds were transformed into the ruined hellscapes today known as Crone Worlds. Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror, once the heart of the Aeldari Empire in the Segmentum Obscurus, seen from several thousand light-years away. Most of the remaining Aeldari gods who themselves existed as entities within the Warp were destroyed by Slaanesh after its cataclysmic birth. Kayla Mensha Kani, the Aeldari god of war, attempted to combat the new Chaos God. But Kaini's form was shattered and exiled to the mortal realm where it came to rest, in the infinity circuits of the Asuriani craft worlds, but could be embodied in the form of animated constructs called avatars, which rested in the hearts of the various craft worlds during times of grave peril. The only other Aeldari gods to survive the fall were the trickster god Segorach, also called the Laughing God, who hid himself within the webway, and Isha, who was ripped from the jaws of Slaanesh by the chaos god Nurgle, who now keeps her as a slave within its hideous garden home within the realm of chaos. The fall utterly destroyed the once vast interstellar Aeldari Empire, leaving scattered bands of Aeldari fighting for survival. Before the fall, vast voidcraft called craft worlds were constructed, enabling those wishing to escape the degeneration of the Aeldari homeworlds to flee, along with samples of their lost world's flora and fauna. When the fall occurred, the various craft worlds rode out the ethereal shockwave in the warp, some being destroyed in the process. The Exodite worlds, far from the epicenter of the terrible catastrophe, were largely untouched by the birth scream of Slaanesh. In order to prevent the events of the fall from ever recurring, the Aeldari of the craft worlds, who now called themselves the Asuryani, but were long known as the Eldar to outsiders, devised the Asuryani path system, by which every craft world Aeldari would follow a strict, almost fanatical life path, pursuing a specific activity such as crafting or war, for a portion of their long lifespans, before switching to another path when the previous one grew stale. In this way, the Asuryani hoped to control the extreme emotional and psychic sensitivity that had left them open to corruption by chaos in the first place. However, some corrupted Aeldari did survive the birth of Slaanesh by taking refuge within the Webway itself. The Webway had long been home to a nearly infinite cavalcade of hyperdimensional subrealms that were protected from Slaanesh's predations by the psychic wards erected within the labyrinth dimension to keep the dangers of the warp at bay. These sadistic beings became known as the Drukhari, or Dark Eldar, to outsiders, the inhabitants of the vast dark city within the Webway called Komorug. The Drukhari later preyed on humans and Asuryani alike to find souls whose torment and anguish they could psychically devour to keep their own tainted souls from being consumed by Slaanesh. Great Crusade, Circa 798, M30 005 M31. Emperor's Great Crusade. The Emperor of Mankind led the Space Marine legions personally during the Great Crusade in the 30th millennium. The Great Crusade of the Emperor of Mankind began as the Age of Strife came to an end for humanity. The warp storms isolating the human colony worlds for 5,000 Terran years had finally disappeared with the birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Aeldari in the 30th millennium. The man known only as the Emperor, a perpetual and the greatest psyker in human history, had emerged mysteriously from the darkness of old night as the greatest warlord of the human home world. The Emperor, with the aid of his friend and ally Malkador the Sigillite, had united Terra under his rule during the Unification Wars, which had ended in 712 M30 in the final decades of the Age of Strife. He intended to use his genetically enhanced Space Marines and the Imperial Army to now reunite all of humanity under his enlightened rule and the rationalist philosophy of the Imperial Truth. Making a pact known as the Treaty of Mars with the cult Mechanicus of the Machine God on Mars in 739 M30, the Emperor promised to allow the tech priests to continue to practice their faith and maintain the political autonomy of their Mechanicum government, if they provided him with the starships and other advanced technology. He needed to reunite the human-settled galaxy. The Emperor was a man of enormous skill in the practice of science and the development of new technology, and so in him, many members of the ancient Mechanicum saw the coming of the Omnissiah, the physical avatar of the machine god, that had been prophesied by their faith. In the treaty they signed with the Emperor, the Mechanicum of Mars pledged their support to the creation of a new Imperium of Man, in which they would serve as the Imperium's primary purveyors of science and technology, in return for first access to any ancient technology, or archaeotech, discovered beyond the bounds of the Sol system. With the signing of the Treaty of Mars, the symbol of the Imperium changed from the raptor's head and lightning bolt icon, used by the Emperor during the Unification Wars on Terra, to the double-headed eagle known as the Aquila, to symbolize the union of the empires of Earth and Mars. With the forge factories and industrial output of Mars, the Emperor was able to refit his armies, and more importantly, he now had the use of the Mechanicum's Titan legions and knights, giant robotic war machines with the potential to dominate the battlefield. At first, the newborn Imperium's expansion into interstellar space was slow, since the Imperial army was still small, and more importantly, the Emperor's 20 Space Marine legions were inhibited by the absence of their primarchs. The genetically engineered transhuman military commanders the Emperor had created during the Unification Wars to lead his eventual reconquest of the galaxy at the head of the Legiones Astartes, but who had been lost to the warp before the end of the Unification Wars due to the machinations of the Chaos Gods. This lack made the time for the creation of a new Space Marine from a normal adolescent human male much longer. However, this difficulty was to end, as on Chthoniya, a planet in a star system not far from Terra. The Emperor for the first time was reunited in 801 M30 with one of his missing primarchs, Horus. Having been discovered at an early age, the Emperor took Horus under his wing and taught him all he knew. Horus and the Emperor had a truly unique bond, that of father and son, and many times they saved each other's lives. But after almost 20 standard years, the Emperor discovered another of the Space Marine Primarchs, Leman Russ, on the icy world of Fenris in 819 M30. Although Horus was pleased at the discovery of one of his brothers, he secretly hoped to always remain the Emperor's favorite son. In time, all the Primarchs were found on the worlds they had been sent to by the will of the ruinous powers of chaos, and each was placed in command of their respective Space Marine legions. The legions, as a result, were massively expanded with new recruits drawn from their Primarchs' adopted homeworlds, and new Space Marines could now be produced within only a single Terran year. But this acceleration and the genocraft techniques employed to bring it about produced fundamental defects within the psyche of each Space Marine, created from certain Primarchs' genetic heritages through this process. These defects were later to prove fatal to many of the Emperor's dreams for humanity. The Great Crusade lasted for 200 standard years, into the early years of the 31st millennium, and brought many long-lost star systems into the fold of the newborn Imperium of Man. Under the command of the War Council of the Emperor and his rediscovered Primarchs, vast expeditionary fleets comprised of the Imperial Army and the 20 Space Marine legions fought back aliens, feral human tribes, petty human dictators, and the warp-tainted forces that had gained control of large portions of human-settled space during the Age of Strife. Once a human-settled world had been pacified, it was brought into imperial compliance by a new imperial planetary governor chosen by the Emperor. Part of this process included the rooting out of any superstitious or religious beliefs of the population. With a respect solely for reason and the measured advancement of science and technology, an atheistic belief system known as the Imperial Truth. The world was then often occupied by a unit or units of the Imperial Army that were left behind to complete the integration of the planet into the Imperium, while the expeditionary fleet, led by the Astartes, moved on to its next target. As the Primarchs took control of the Space Marine legions that had been crafted from their gene seed, the Great Crusade separated, moving in many directions and reaching far across the galaxy. After the Imperial Crusade on the world of Ulanor concluded in Erozozerod M30, upon bringing that planet into Imperial compliance after the defeat of a great force of orcs, the Emperor claimed it as the greatest victory of the Imperium to date, and that Horus should be given all credit. Hailing Horus and his Lunar Wolves Legion, later renamed the Sons of Horus, the Emperor stated that he would have to leave the expeditionary fleets behind and return to Terra to begin the next secret phase of his plan, to ensure humanity's domination of the galaxy. In his place, the Emperor announced that Horus would be declared War Master of the Imperium, the de facto commander of all the Emperor's armies on the Great Crusade, although Horus was troubled that the Emperor should leave him and his brother Primarchs to carry on alone for some unknown reason. With Horus as their new commander, the Imperium's armies and Space Marines continued to expand ever outwards, rediscovering lost human worlds and bringing them into the enlightened Imperium's fold. This expansion lasted for 5 more standard years until the outbreak of the terrible Imperial Civil War known as the Horus Heresy in UO 5 M31. And that, dear listener, will have to be enough for today, I'm afraid. But when we next meet, we shall have the unfortunate discussions required of a subject as terrible as the Horus Heresy.